Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. We got a great show for you this evening. Bill Carter, who actually reached out to me during one of my live streams, and I popped in my email address, and we've been in touch. Very interesting guy. Should be quite fascinating, and so stay tuned for that. Just a couple of things. First of all, here's our latest blog, and that is by Charles Lear, it's titled "A 1989 UFO Occupant Report from Voronezh, Russia." That's one case that I've always been fascinated in, and I don't know what to make of it after reading his research because it could have been one of those things that was a hoax. It's hard. Hate to say that because it seemed like such an interesting one, but anyway, check that out over at podcastufo.com. And if you're listening to this show and it has commercials on audio, you can always just join Patreon for $3 or more a month and be ad free. And that is right on our website under supporting us. So anyway, we are about ready to bring our guest in. I want to thank everyone that watches the show, listens to the show. I really appreciate it, and glad you're here. Hello, Bill.
Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you, and finally get to talk to you, Martin. I know we've spoken a few times, just touch and go, but I'm glad to finally be able to sit down with you.
Yes, absolutely. And you were in the military. Did I hear you say 3 times?
Yeah. I served 4 in the Marine Corps, 3 in the Army and National Guard, and then 3 again in just the National Guard the last time I was in.
That's pretty amazing. So, but you also, one of the things you told me is, so you had a childhood UFO sighting that kind of alerted you to there's something going on unusual.
Yeah. When I was living in Hull, Georgia, right outside of Athens, Georgia, my family lived there when I was really young, and it happened around 1977. We were outside. It was pretty warm that night. I remember it because I didn't have any shoes on. Back then, kids, they like to run around barefooted a lot, and I was going from my uncle's house. He lived, well, it was actually a trailer across from ours. We lived in a very, very small trailer park in Hull, Georgia. And I was going across this little gravel road going to our trailer that we lived in, and I saw something out the corner of my eye. And it looked at first like a glowing fire. I thought actually that the field was on fire. I'd never really been around any like big fires or anything at that age, but it was enough to scare me. And I just froze and looked at it. And I could see it was about maybe 80 yards away. And I could see these colors like orangish red coming through the trees. And while I was standing there, I heard my mother behind me calling my name. She was whispering, and she was off to my left. And her and my sister were ducked down behind the trailer that we lived in, trying to get me across the road. So finally, I ran across the road and got behind her. And I kept trying to look at it, trying to, just see what it was, because she wasn't giving any explanations, and I could tell she was pretty scared herself. And that was basically all I remembered at the time. So fast forward to 2009, and my unit was at Eglin Air Force Base, and we were there for about 2 weeks. We actually had 2 missions there. One was marijuana eradication, and the other was garrison security. And the days we did garrison security, we did it with the Air Force security force guys. And one day he asked if I wanted to go up to this site with him. It was a restricted site. It didn't look very impressive at all. And it looked like just a small radio station, basically. And we got out. I went in behind him, and as soon as we got into the lobby, there was another Air Force security force guy over to my left, and on the wall I read this huge mission statement that read, "We monitor all space activity, terrestrial and extraterrestrial, from planet Earth." And my jaw just dropped. And when I read that, I immediately thought about the time when I was in Georgia back in 1977. And I thought about something I hadn't thought about since I was a kid. And I looked over to my left, and this guard at this podium over to the left is just grinning from ear to ear at me, reading this sign. And the security force guy that went in there ahead of me, he was talking to a guy in a white lab coat. And I didn't take another step into the place. I basically was just awestruck by what I was seeing, because the place, it really wasn't impressive. It looked like maybe like an old radio station or something. Even when we left, I'd never talked to the guy about what the place was after we left. It took me a few years to really think about what I'd saw there. And I recalled when we got to the base, usually when you get to a new military base, you get a safety briefing. Usually military police will get what you call a trying to remember the word that we used for that. You get basically a brief every day before you go out on patrol. Well, they give you the rundown of the base, and one of the things they told us there when we got there was that if we rode with the Marine Patrol in the water surrounding the base, that we might get to see some space junk that occasionally falls in the water surrounding the base. Now, I had forgot about them telling us that when we first got there. We all just kind of laughed it off, and I remember thinking that's something I would not want to do, especially if it's been somewhere else and it falls in the water. I didn't want to touch the thing, whatever it was. So some interesting things happened, when I had time to look back on the place after I left. One of the days that I was in Humvee when we were doing marijuana eradication, I had stopped on a dirt road not far from the site C6 where I was there. And I had to make a nature call. So I heard like a twig crack or something behind me, and I looked over, and it was about 10 guys dressed in black. They had black camouflage faces, and they had these like rappelling helmets like special forces would use. They weren't like regular military helmets. And where we were billeted there, it was about 5 miles away from the Army Ranger camp where we were. So after I left Eglin, a few years later, I had mentioned to my mother about what happened to us in Hull, Georgia, back in the 70s, and she about jumped out of her chair when I mentioned it. She said, "You remember that?" I said, "Yeah, I remember it. Remember it very well, because I'd always thought that maybe it was a dream, but I remember us going through a barbed wire fence the next day. The next day after that happened, we had a barbed wire fence at the end of the trailer park. So you have, let me give you a picture of what the trailer park looked like. It had like 4 trailers on one side, 4 on the other. To me as a kid, it looked huge, but going back years later, it's just a small place. But then you had like a gravel driveway that went through the middle of it. And at the end, there was a barbed wire fence and a big field next to where we lived. So the next day we go through the barbed wire fence, and I remembered us standing around a huge burnt circle on the ground. And she was really surprised that I remembered it. And I asked her about it, and she had never told me what happened that night because I remembered seeing it. I remember, getting behind her. She said that I kept trying to look around her to see it. But what she told me was that she had seen it land, and that when she seen like a ramp come out of the thing, she said that's when she got us and took us in the house and locked the door. And I asked her why, they never called the police. I said, you ever talk to anybody about it? She said no, because a lot of people were having sightings down there back in those days, and that they were putting people in mental institutions and locking them up for reporting it, and that people were coming up missing.
Wow.
So I met a guy that actually worked at Site C6. I met him through Reddit, and he had worked at the site from 1981 to 84. I think I gave you our chat transcripts from what I talked to him about, but
Yes.
I told him how impressed I was with the place and if there was any truth to, what I read on the wall there. He said, absolutely. He said that they definitely tracked UFOs from there when he worked there. He told me that he had friends that he was told that committed suicide, that he never saw their bodies, and that the place had been sued several times over the years, that the radar itself was so strong, like if birds fly through it, they would evaporate. I mean, just blow them up. It was that strong. And I was talking to my mom more about it. She actually drew a picture of what the thing looked like. And she also told me before that incident that night, her and her fiance, his brother and his date were going down the road, and her fiance's brother looked out of the back glass of the car when they were going down the road, and one had started following them. And she said they were scared to death. And that night, they went home and they all started carpooling to work. That's how bad it got, and that's how frightened a lot of them were. Well, a few years later, he come up missing. He's never been found. I've never seen his name on any like missing persons list, and I thought that was odd because I thought, well, maybe I could find him somewhere on a missing persons list somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Because I had found her fiance's obituary from 2006, and his brother was still listed as missing. I found their sister's obituary. She died a few years later, and he was still listed as missing. From what I understand, he was coming home from work one night, never made it. But my grandmother also had a story. I never paid it much attention until I recalled what happened to me and my mother that night, because my mother, like I said, my mother and I never discussed what happened to us ever between each other until I brought it up.
Mm-hmm. So what happened with your grandmother? Did you say something happened to your grandmother?
Yeah, she told a story twice that I remember. She said that she was coming home from work one night and she was going around a curve, and the curve had like a little hill that separated the curve in between it, and this thing had gone in front of her. It was directly over her car till she got to the curve. Then it flew over her, and she said she could see the glow from it on the other side of the curve, and she was terrified that when she rounded the curve, it was still going to be sitting there in the road. And she said that when she got around the curve, that it moved out of the way. She said that she just pushed the gas as far as she could, and she just held on to the steering wheel, and she said she just gave it all the gas she could. She only talked about it 2 times that I remember, but I never paid much attention to it until I recalled the night that my mother and my sister and I had our encounter.
And you said your sister was too young to remember?
Yeah, she was. I think she might have been 1 or 2 years. She's 2 years younger than me, and I was around 4 at the time. But it's something I would never forget. And like I said, my mother, she, it's something that scared the wits out of her. I mean, she just did not like talking about it. We had a girl from NYU come down about 2 years ago and interview us for about 3 days. I haven't got to see the documentary yet. She talked to us for 3 days about what happened, and she left. And I've tried to contact her. I've sent messages to her. She was Chinese. She did say that she was going back to China probably after she graduated. She was a senior at NYU. I picked her up from the airport in Huntsville and brought her here, and we spoke with her for about 2 or 3 days. But it's floating around out there somewhere. I've never got a chance to see it.
Now, when you and your mother and your sister all had this encounter, are you or was your mother aware, when you talked to your mother recently, was she aware of anyone else that witnessed it besides the 3 of you?
The night that we saw what we saw?
Yes.
No. I know that my uncle lived across the street from us. I don't really remember what time of the night it was when it happened, but she did not like talking about it. I was lucky that she even, mentioned to me and admitted to it. And I had to ask her about it before she would even talk about it, because I was thinking the other day, maybe she talked to my grandmother about it or my grandfather, but she never mentioned it around them, growing up. She said whatever it was, it had 3 legs that extended to the ground. And she said that she saw a hatch on it open, and there was some kind of like a ramp that came down to the ground. And she said when she saw that, that's when she grabbed us and took us inside. I was amazed that she never told me that story, because my mother, if she knows something, she can't keep a secret.
Now, so there's what we call, or I don't say we call, but ufologists call as trace evidence, when there's the grass burn that you're talking about, the circular burn mark, and that would have been a really great thing to investigate if people were involved. But I'm assuming that she didn't tell anyone or report this to anyone.
Well, that's when my military police training kicked in. I asked her, I said, why didn't you call somebody? Why didn't you tell somebody? She said they were locking people up down there that were reporting it. She said there was a lot of sightings down there, and they were putting people in mental hospitals that were reporting that stuff.
God.
So I said, well, I can kind of understand then if that's the case. But I know she told me that it got to the point where her and my grandmother and my uncles, they would work at the same places sometimes, and they would all carpool to work because they didn't want to drive out by themselves. That's how bad it got.
Wow. Amazing. So I guess you'd call this a flap. And can you tell me approximately what years this was happening?
This was, we've kind of went back and forth on the year. It was 1977 or 78. I think it was probably around end of 77, but I remember it being warm that night. And I remember the guys in the trailer park working on a car talking about the Leonard Skinner crash.
Oh, isn't that bizarre you're saying that? Because I just talked about that yesterday.
Oh, really?
Isn't that crazy? Yeah. And I have a witness that's listening live right now that's bizarre. I just talked about the crash yesterday.
But I remember that discussion for like a time reference, but that night I remember I was barefooted. So if it was October, I know there's sometimes, October can be warm, but I don't know exactly if it was the end of 77, first of 78, somewhere around in there.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like what they call a flap. I mean, like all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of sightings in one area. There's been many areas in this country alone where these flaps occur. And that's always puzzled me. Like, the thought comes to my mind, if something traveled as far as it did to get here, why is it staying in one area? It's such a bizarre situation, in my opinion.
Well, I hadn't thought anything about like UFOs or anything like that until back in, I think, 1991. We had cattle mutilations close to here where I lived. We had national news here. If you've ever heard the story about the Fife UFO, I live about 12 miles away from Fife, Alabama. And back around 1991, we had cattle mutilations, and we
Really?
had a lot of UFO sightings. Yeah, CNN came here. A lot of different news organizations that were around at that time came here, and there's some interviews that you can see on YouTube. With farmers that said these things came over their farms, and some of them got guns to shoot at them. Bill Hicks, the comedian,
Oh, yeah.
makes a joke about it. He's got a funny take on the Fife UFO. It's pretty funny. If you ever get a chance to watch his little bit about the Fife UFO.
Yeah, he was crazy, that guy. Died young, very young of cancer, but what a fun comedian he was. So there is a question here for you. The person changed something in it. Let me just see what it is. Space track radar. Are you familiar with space track radar? Is that uh,
No, sir.
any of this UCT, any of that? So you didn't actually work with this stuff, but you went into that building. Is that right?
Right. I went inside there, and after I read their mission statement on the wall, I didn't want to take another step, and the hair on the back of my neck, just stood up. And I'd already been overseas at that point, and it took a lot to spook me. And I had not thought about the UFO experience from when I was a kid at all until I went into that building, and something deep inside of me told me to get out. Um, and I got goosebumps when I read it, and I looked over at the security forces guy at the podium there. When I looked over at him, and he just gave me a big smile, and I walked back out to the truck that we were in. We were in like a pickup truck when we went up there, and I had to, collect myself for a minute because I just had this flashback of when I was a kid and what I saw in the field that night, and I hadn't recalled those things for a very very long time, and it was just a few years ago that I finally got the nerve to talk to my mother about it, because I kept having these visions of seeing this look like a fireball out in the field, and just her, because we had never discussed it, and I always thought, well, if it was real, maybe she would have talked to me about it all this time. And when I brought it up, she about jumped out of her skin. She was in a chair, and I swear she jumped about 2 or 3 feet up in the air when I mentioned it to her. Um, and we discussed it, and I told her, I said, why, have you not mentioned it to me all these years? And she said it scared her to death.
There's someone in chat that's claiming that they worked at Site C6. But so I can't take that at face value because I don't know this person. But can you tell us what the capabilities of the radar, as far as you know? You said it was very, very powerful,
Mhm.
but like how far out it can detect things and how, what type of accuracy and all that.
Right. It can detect objects 22,000 nautical miles into space the size of a grapefruit.
Is
And
that, wow.
it can track, thousands of objects at one time. And you can actually Google Site C6 and it can verify everything that I'm telling you, about the site itself, which I know a lot of people that work there would probably not be privy to tell you that they can do that. But if they have that capability, everything that we've been seeing, like the drones and all that stuff, they definitely have the capabilities to see all this stuff. So,
Now, when you say they could,
place.
I'm wondering what type of sweep this thing would make as far as, you're saying up to 22,000 nautical miles, but what patch of the sky, I'm wondering, how much could that cover?
Well, from what I understand, it acts like a space fence. Um, I don't know the range, but it extends, I think, to the Kwajalein atolls out in the Pacific Ocean.
Hmm.
Now, if these things are coming out of the ocean, like what they've been saying, lately, they would have the ability to see it, especially being down there in the Gulf of America, as it's called now. They would definitely have the capabilities to do it. Now, I've kind of been passively threatened a few times on Reddit. I don't do a lot of social media. The only ones I really do is Reddit because I enjoy reading. But someone had said something about me being disabled and having benefits taken from me and all this kind of stuff. And I had never mentioned to anybody that I was even, had disabilities like that, but it wasn't anything like what some people would say would be like attributed to like PTSD or anything. A lot of mine's like physical disabilities, but I think that it's like I remember his name is Burchett.
Oh yeah, timber.
Tim Burchett. When you get over the target, that's when they start shooting at you. And typically, like when I post something on Reddit lately, anything that has to do with Eglin, usually they will mute upvotes where you can't upvote on it. One of the things that I had was it had 20,000 views, but 0 upvotes. And I thought that was kind of odd that you have 20,000 views and no upvotes on it whatsoever. And Reddit will not even let me report the issue. Like when I go to submit like a complaint, it won't let me file a complaint about it. It's really, really strange.
Do you know? Whoops, sorry. Do you understand what this is saying up on the screen? I don't understand what that is. Do you?
Kwajalein,
Oh.
Eglin can track out to yes, it can. It extends from Eglin all the way to the Kwajalein atolls, from what I understand. I think if you find it online, it'll tell you the same thing.
Interesting. So the one question I have, I would think that, you mentioned that when you walked into that building, that non-distinct building, like a radio station or whatever, and they had their mission statement up on the wall. That's kind of a bold thing. Do you think that was? I mean, it almost seems like it's kind of like a mockery in a type of way. I mean, for them to say something like that, and also, it seems to me that someone would have to have a really good high level of clearance before they'd walk into a place like that.
Well, being MPs, all the military police have to have a secret security clearance because you have to be able to go to any place on a military base. The site itself is restricted. If I didn't have a clearance, I couldn't go in there. Now, when it comes to skiffs and things like that, if they have a place in there that's for top secret information that they share amongst one another. I couldn't go into a place like that, but the building itself, I was able to go in with no problem at all. Um, it's it's a restricted site. Actually, it's located about 12 to 15 miles inside the base, and like I was saying earlier, it's not underground, it's above ground. It's actually like on a little hill. It looks like an old radio station when you see it.
Hmm. Someone is the person. I think it's the same person that said that they worked there. Is saying that it's 2,500 nautical miles, not 25,000. Is that a possibility that you mix that up?
From what I read, it's 22,000, but unless they updated it recently, it's
Hmm.
it's actually on Wikipedia. You can actually go to Wikipedia and type in Site C6, and it'll tell you all that you want to know about the radar itself. Other than they don't track UFOs, they won't admit to that. But other things on there, like the size of the objects that they can track, it's all in there.
And uh, did that site C6 burn down at one time? Are you aware of that?
Yes, I think back in the '60s it burned down.
Ah, uh-huh. Which that's probably when they refitted it with all the higher end equipment. Of course, they're always upgrading, and I also think that artificial intelligence is going to make everything change as far as what we're doing,
See, right
tracking things.
now the Space Force took it over. It was Air Force when I was there in 2009,
Hmm.
and now it's turned over to the Space Force. The Space Force operates that facility now.
Wow. Yep. So, have you been paying? It sounds like you've been paying some attention to what's going on in the UFO community. Like you're familiar with the hearings and all that, and Tim Burchett you mentioned.
Yeah, I haven't watched anything over the last few months. I think a lot of things that have been said are, to me, a little outrageous. But I I do try to listen to the ones I think, to me, are telling the truth. I still follow Grush, and
Hmm.
he's one that I pay attention to because he came out and said what he said, and they made sure to get him out of the way. They don't want him talking to nobody right now, and that's interesting to me.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lawsuit situation out there, and that's why we're not really hearing from him these days. I don't know how any. I've just probably been told not to, do any public speaking at this point, but we may hear from him at some point. I did get the chance to meet him when I was at the hearing. It's at both hearings that they had, and I think they're
Now,
going to be having some coming up too.
um, what's interesting to me was that David Grush came forward over in Huntsville, Alabama, and I live pretty close to Huntsville. There was a lady. She was a scientist. She was working on some kind of propulsion system over there, and she died. Um, Apparently, they said she died by suicide, is what the official thing was. And she made a series of videos. Her name was Amy Eskridge, and she had made some videos before she died that somebody was after her.
Hmm.
Now, what I thought was interesting was David Grush came forward after she died, and he came forward in Huntsville, and that's where she worked. And he was scared from what I saw when he came forward to George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell. He stumbled upon something that scared him enough to come forward and talk.
Hmm.
And I've always thought that her death could be linked to something that he knew, and that's probably one of the reasons I felt like he came forward. There was another scientist over there, and she came up missing for a few years, but later on they found her, and they found out she was working for the CIA or something. I think she was a Chinese national or something, but nobody could find her for a few years. And I can't remember her name, but she was a scientist over there in Huntsville. And somebody was looking for her, and they contacted her son. And he told them what she had been doing, and that as soon as she started working for the CIA, she got really, really strange, and she was not like the same person. But
It's the X-Files syndrome.
yeah, yeah. To me, uh, when I found out that Grush came forward from Huntsville, that told me a lot.
Right. Now there was an incident in 2023 at Eglin Air Force Base. Are you familiar with that? Did you look into that at all?
No, sir.
Yeah.
I think
Someone
there was
just
a plane crash or something. I don't know.
well, I just looked online. Someone posted that in the chat, and there is a report that was done um, through AARO through that office. So they wrote a report on it, and anyone can find that online if you Google that. But I just wondered if you had heard about that.
No, but I've talked to a lot of people that live around Eglin, and they always tell me they see some interesting things around Eglin.
It's strange, you know. I mean, some of them I guess could be experimental craft. I mean, I'm not sure if that would be something like that would be in a hangar and test it out that at that Air Force Base in particular. But you know, we talked quickly offline before we started about the Paul Benowitz case and that situation in New Mexico, and you know, he was seeing weird things and filming them, and you know, they basically drove him crazy. And if you're new to this subject, if you just look up the Paul Benowitz, I'm not going to try to spell that. But anyway, if you look up his case, it's fascinating. It's very sad, you know. And there's still Rick Doty was involved in that. He's out there. I'm going to keep my mouth shut on what I think of him. So.
Well, another interesting thing that happened at Eglin one day, I was eating lunch with one of the security force guys that I was working with. One of the days I was out, and we were by this runway with a huge hangar at the end of it, and I kept seeing these planes take off without markings. They were white jet planes. And I asked him, I said, what are these white planes taking off with no tail number, no insignia, nothing on them? And he said that they called them secret squirrel planes. And I said, who's in them? You know, he said, well, no, that's CIA. They do different things down here. And he said, that's all we know. You know, they have different projects that go on down there. And I said, wow, I've never seen anything like that before. I've heard of the Janet flights that go in and out of the airport from Las Vegas. But they looked a little different. They were bigger planes out in Las Vegas that I saw from the footage that I've seen, and these planes were just totally white.
Wow. I'm going to see if we, Bill, if you're listening, I'm going to see if we can, if you have phones, if you can fire them up. I'm not sure. I know Chanel, my regular radio producer at KGRA, she's out tonight, and I'm just going to find out if we have phones, because I wouldn't mind getting the person in on a call that keeps discussing about the same exact, you know, he says he worked where you did. So if I can, if we can get them on, I'm just not sure. So Bill, hopefully you're listening. And if you are, please let me know in the private chat if we have phones available tonight. So, you know, when someone has an experience when they're really young, you know, sometimes it might feel like a dream or, you know, not feel real. I don't know exactly how old you were. I can't remember what you said, but I think that's great.
I was around probably 3-4 years old. I was probably more about 4 years old when it happened.
Yeah, that's very young. So, but it's great that your mother actually confirmed that for you. I mean, did you kind of like put that away in your head and not even think about it, and then until this all happened at the airbase?
Right. I mean, I just thought, no, surely, I didn't see that. And when I went to Eglin, uh, there's very few times I've ever felt like the hair on the back of my neck stand up. And
Hmm.
as soon as I got in that building and I read that on their wall there, I got just terrified inside. I mean, I felt like I did the night that I saw that. It stopped me in my tracks where I couldn't move and I couldn't really believe what I was reading. And I didn't talk to anybody in my unit about it when I went back. And it just took me a while to process what I was seeing, really. And I when I think about it now, it's just, questions more than anything. And it made me want to get to the bottom of what I saw. So
Mm-hmm.
I ended up meeting a guy that actually worked at the site for 3 years. And he was telling me, he gave me a name of a guy that was there that died. They told him that the guy committed suicide, but he said there was never a funeral, no body. Um, and he said that one night they brought something to the site, and he said they never brought anything up there, but one night they brought something on a flatbed truck that was covered, and he said he didn't get to see what it was, but he named off companies I'd never heard of that he had worked for. It was the first time I'd ever heard EG&G, I think was one of them,
Hmm.
and which I'd never heard of any of these places that he had worked for. But I really uh, got my attention when he had mentioned that they did monitor UFOs, and he had friends after he left when they had the sightings in I think it was 1994 down there. I'm trying to remember what part of Florida it was, but they had a name for it. It was a UFO flap that happened down there. Not Homestead. Um, I'm trying to remember, but he said that he had friends that were monitoring the ones that they were seeing then in the 90s when people were setting up cameras out there on the beach recording those things. Um, he said it was really interesting. I tried to get him to talk to someone about what we spoke about, and he did try once, but he said they never, you know, said anything back to him when he sent them an email. And I've tried to get him to talk about it because I think he's at an age where he just felt like he really didn't care at that point to talk about it. And I think he probably doesn't know now that he's even being talked about. But um, it meant a lot to me because I had been, trying to find something about that place and what I saw. And when I put two and two together, like when I talked to Ross Coulthard, he was more concerned about just the UFO nuts and bolts crafts and things like that. But, it's not that easy to tell one thing and not tell the other, because had I not had the experience when I was a kid, I probably would have thought nothing about what I read when I went into that place. I'd have probably just, looked at it and said, "Oh, that's cool," and walked out, because I know earlier you had mentioned about, mission statements and how a lot of units goof around and put stuff up like that. But not everybody can see the mission statements there. You have to have at least a secret clearance to go inside the place. The public can't go in there. You
Mm-hmm.
have to have business to be there in the first place.
That makes sense. So I think what I would like to do is this gentleman, claims he worked there, Pete, and I'm going to give out my email address. I'll connect you too, because I think, if you'd like. So my email address, Pete, I don't mind saying it verbally. I get a bunch of junk mail anyway. It's martin@podcastufo.com. Just get in touch with me and we'll connect you two together. So he's basically saying that the space objects that are uncorrelated, they are uncorrelated with the catalog. And he's claiming he worked there until 1989. But I think it's fascinating. And, I mean, if they have this technology, it just seems, I've asked this question many times with people on the guests I have on the show. Isn't there anything that would be, detecting these things coming in from out
Exactly.
there?
And
You know?
the government's not going to tell you they see them. I mean, we've been hoping that, there'd be some kind of new legislation where they would, be more forthcoming and tell us things. And, they're not going to admit that they, can do that. But when you know what kind of capabilities they do have there, um, they can do it. If they want to admit to it, that's another thing.
Right. Yeah. And what do you think about, since you've been paying attention to this, do you feel like there's a lot more transparency, or do you think it's status quo?
I think it's more status quo, and I think they're throwing people in there to muddy the waters, basically to make people lose interest. Some of the stories that I've heard lately are just outrageous, really. I mean, I had when I saw what I saw when I was a kid, um, I froze. I didn't get a feeling of heavenly bodies or just like a some heavenly experience or anything. I was scared of it from
Hmm.
what I saw. I know people have different experiences with them. That wasn't my experience. Maybe if I'd have been a little bit older, I would have looked at it different. But my mother was older, and it scared her too. So
Yeah.
um, I don't really I don't really know that everyone has the same experience.
I agree 100%, and I've heard all different takes on, when someone, I had a personal UFO experience in 2007, and I was just, uh, I was not scared, but I was bewildered. Like I just couldn't understand what I was seeing. It didn't fit in my normal, world to see something that I was seeing. So, but I understand, you know, there's all kinds of weird ways people react to these things. Sometimes they'll never talk about it at all. Or, I have a friend, I'm in the antiques world and antiques and art and all that. And I have a friend that contacted me because he saw that I did a show on UFOs. And he told me his story. He was walking in Ipswich, Massachusetts, I think it was. And this big glowing object came right down by him and two other kids, and it was like they were, every time they look up at it, it was still there and they were scared to death. He can't get either one of them to talk about it. And you hear a lot of stories like that because it affects people, all people differently.
If I hadn't have brought it up to my mother, she would have never mentioned it to me. Um, I think nowadays people are more aware of it. I know there is a site on YouTube called Eyes on Cinema. If you've ever
Right.
watched some of
Yes,
the
I'm
videos,
in touch with the person there. Yes.
I
Hmm.
mean, they have some of the best interviews out there. And if you look at some of the testimonies by people that have seen things, uh, a lot of them are very similar. And this was before like mainstream media now started covering some of it.
Now, when the person came to interview you and your mother and was there for 3 days, I believe you said,
Yeah,
did you learn more about it at that time by hearing, when your mother was questioned? Did you learn more?
well, yeah, I learned what it looked like because she'd never drawn a picture of it before. And the girl that was interviewing us, she wanted to know what it looked like, and my mother, drew like one of the classic saucer shaped things. It was a saucer shape, but it had legs that extended to the ground, and then she drew the ramp that came out of it. Now, the next day when we went out to the field, I know that when you're a kid, a lot of times things seem a lot bigger to you. But just guessing, I would say the circle that thing left was probably 20 or 30 feet, like round circumference. So I've often wondered if I went back there now, if you could still get some kind of readings from where it was at, because it was, I think it had moved like from where I saw it to where my mother saw it, because I saw it off to my right that night. And the next day, when we went out to the field, it was more directly in front of the road that went through the trailer park. And I thought to myself, well, I guess it moved because it was off to my right from what I remember, because I caught it out the corner of my eye. And then when I looked directly at it, I just froze solid. I mean, I just couldn't move. Had my mother not been calling my name behind me, I would have just sat there and looked at it and never budged.
Yeah. I mean, so we are just about ready to wrap it up right now, but I wanted to let everyone know that Roger Stankovic and Irene Previn from Australia, they're going to be on next week's show, same time. So are you comfortable with me sharing your information for someone like this person that claims he was, of course we could talk about this off air, but I do appreciate very much you being on the show tonight. And I guess one last question: has this affected you in this whole experience in like a negative way, or you're saying that the incident itself did, but I mean in general now when you look back on it, or are you kind of glad that it happened?
Well, now that I've had time to think about it, for the last few years it became like an obsession. I've kind of learned to let it go a little bit over the last few months, especially when a lot of people have been coming out to me that, to me, I just don't believe. Frankly, I just don't believe what they're saying. And it's something that I really don't think about until I talk about it. When I did the interview for News Nation, I felt like I was being cross-examined, by Ross. And I wish that he would have let me talk more about the one thing, because when I talked about the incident I had when I was a kid versus, what I saw when I was in the military, I really couldn't tell one story without the other, because
I see. Yeah.
I saw that, and if I hadn't saw what I saw when I was younger, when I went into that place, I would have never put two and two together.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Martin, and I appreciate you having me on.
You bet. All right, everyone, we'll see you next week. And remember to keep your eyes to the sky.